I do think that there is a potential risk of self-sabotage on a global basis. We are going to end up restricting the Premier League unnecessarily.
Hello, welcome back to talkSPORT's YouTube channel. I'm Anna Smith, and today I'm joined by a football finance expert, Stefan Borson. So, Stefan, I wanted to talk today about the proposed salary cap of sorts that we're hearing about for the Premier League. We're talking basically about a new set of financial regulations, aren't we, that was being voted on next month. Can you just explain exactly what's being proposed?
Yeah, so we currently have a situation where you've got the clubs in the Premier League having to look at PSR, the historic rules that limit the spending of £105 million. And for some time now, for about 2 years, the clubs and the Premier League have been considering whether they overlay and add additional rules that look more similar to those rules that are operated by UEFA. And in the UEFA rules, you have effectively a test that looks at the calendar year and says that you can spend up to 70% of your revenue on what's known as player costs, and that's player wages, head coach wages, and amortization. And then there's a cap of 70%. And the clubs have been thinking about bringing in both that rule, but with a limit of 85% in the Premier League for most clubs. And on top of that, this thing called anchoring, which is effectively a soft salary cap, because what it does is it says that the total that can be spent by the clubs in relation to players and also amortization will be 5 times what the lowest club received from the broadcast revenue. So if you go back to look at what that is, that's about £110 million. So if you look at either one of the last couple of years, the side that finished bottom of the Premier League received round about £110 million, which means that the cap that would be put in place for clubs' wages and amortization would therefore be £550 million. And that would apply across the league. And obviously, if over time the broadcast revenue grows such that it becomes 120 and 130, etc., then that 5 times multiple would obviously mean that the limit would also increase. So that in a global sense is what people are talking about when they talk about anchoring or this new soft wage cap.
So who's in favour of it and who isn't? Do we know?
Well, we know more about who's not in favour of it. And unsurprisingly, when you look at the analysis as to who might be quite close to the limit, the 2 clubs that stand out that have got, and this is quite broad brush because we're working on a lot of estimates here, but if you look at a lot of estimates based on the historic data, the 2 clubs that stand out as being closest to the limit would be Manchester City and Manchester United. And sure enough, when you go back to the media briefings that a number of publications have had, it does appear that the key clubs who are lobbying the rest of the clubs to reject the concept of anchoring do appear to be the 2 Manchester clubs. Chelsea are a club who's also quite close, and they've abstained from previous votes to look at implementing it. So the reality is here that you're not going to find that there are many clubs that would even really consider voting against it, because for the vast majority of the league, there's no prospect of them ever getting close to 5 times the bottom clubs spend. So, i.e., if you look at least 2/3 of the league, they're never going to spend £550 million on wages and amortization. So clearly, the only clubs that are going to be considering rejecting the proposal right now would be those clubs in the top 6, plus maybe Newcastle United, Aston Villa, the clubs that are talked about as being the aspirational clubs. Those clubs may well want to restrict new rules coming in. But really, this is about the wealthiest clubs at the top of the table being asked to implement effectively another cap and another barrier to their spending.
So when we're hearing clubs saying that it will stop them attracting the best players, that we'll lose some of the best players that are currently in the Premier League to other, big sides in Europe, how realistic do you think that is?
Well, I think what they're saying is if you were to look at the competitive landscape for the biggest clubs in the country, so for City, Arsenal, Liverpool, United, etc., those clubs, they say, are not only competing within the Premier League, but they're also competing on a global basis, but also particularly on a European basis with Real Madrid, Bayern Munich, Paris Saint-Germain, etc. And the nature of the restrictions that those clubs have would be probably the UEFA rules that we spoke about earlier, which would set a limit of around about 70% of their revenue for these wages and amortization costs, which of course the Premier League clubs are already capped into, so they also have that 70%. But if you were to look at somebody like Real Madrid right now, Real Madrid are doing, for round numbers, £1 billion of revenue, so their cap would be 700 million. Well, you set that against where the Premier League team's cap would be. Well, obviously that would be the 5 times the 110. So their cap. So the Premier League clubs would be capped at 550, whereas Real Madrid would be capped at 700 million. And so the Premier League clubs will say, well, why would we put ourselves in an immediate disadvantage? And then if you look at the Saudi Arabia competition, shall we say, well, obviously they've got no cap. They're not bound by the UEFA rules, and therefore they have no such cap. So the argument goes, this is a self-sabotage cap for our biggest clubs on a global basis, and it may well mean that at some point in the future that they are restricted in terms of the players that they can sign because they're in competition with teams with effectively bigger budgets. Now, I don't think it's a very powerful argument as it sits here today, because there's only one team in the world, Real Madrid, who are doing £1 billion of revenue. And so there's probably only one team in the whole of Europe who has a higher budget than 5 times the lowest team in the Premier League, this £550 million limit. So I think what the clubs are trying to say, and they're doing it, I do think some of the quotes are very much overplayed that are being made in the press about the risks here. I certainly, there does seem to be a tendency when these new rules are tabled for everybody to declare that it's the end of football as we know it. I think it's an extreme reaction to it. But put that to one side, I think what the clubs are saying is, look, we've got a potential risk here where the risk might not be today, but it may be that in 2 or 3 years, maybe, for example, the next TV deal is a down deal and is not an increase. And maybe the bottom club, rather than getting 110 million, gets, 90. Well, then at that point, obviously with the 5 times, all of a sudden you've got a big dip in the cap that the clubs would have from 550 to, let's say, 450. And all of a sudden the clubs are left with a situation where they've got a cost base that's generated towards 550, but the rules have changed. So then there's now a cap of 450. And in that scenario, the clubs are going to be forced into making sales and forced to do things that they don't want to do. And then on top of that, there's just this competitive element with the rest of the world. The Premier League sits as the Premier League. All of a sudden, the last thing you want is to be effectively forced to restrain your spending on the very best players, because ultimately that will affect whether the Premier League remains the Premier League in the world. So those are the fears. I mean, I think it is quite a hard argument for those clubs to run, largely because a 550 cap and whatever it goes to in all likelihood over the years is actually a pretty big cap, and is bettered probably only by Real Madrid right now, and even in the future, there's a good chance that it will not restrict the Premier League clubs really at all compared to even Bayern Munich, PSG, and Barcelona.
Do you think it makes any difference in the effect it could have on the Premier League itself in terms of the competitiveness with, like you say, the traditional top six and the clubs that are coming up from the Championship every year? Do you think it will make a difference there?
Which shouldn't make much difference at all at the bottom end of the table or even in the middle of the table, because the limit that it's going to set is going to be, 5 times 550, and these clubs are just nowhere near it. If you were to do an analysis of the buffer that those teams have got right now, they've got hundreds of millions of buffer. If you go, I don't know, let's say below Newcastle United in the revenue chart, those teams have got huge buffers from 550 when you do the analysis of what the wage cost is, and it's not the total wage. And so we are estimating a lot of this. That is worth saying. The proposal is not that you take the total wage cost, but it's that you take the wage cost of the team, of the first team, and the head coach, and the amortization, similar to the UEFA rules. So we don't know for sure what most of these numbers are. There's only one team, I think, from memory, Crystal Palace, are the only team that currently details what their player wage cost is. But we do have some information where we can estimate the others. Bottom line is all of the clubs below, let's say in Newcastle, have got loads of capacity anyway. So it's not going to affect teams coming up. I think the argument that they would make is it's actually the opposite, because what it's doing is meaning that the top clubs just can't get so far ahead, can't just keep going and keep spending, that they have to show a level of restraint to keep them at least in some kind of relatively close contact with the rest of the Premier League. And then, as I say, I think that the top clubs are having a different argument, which is, well, okay, we get that we're meant to be restrained versus the rest of the league table, but we've already got a whole load of rules that are doing that, because we've got PSR, we've got sustainability rules, we've got the UEFA rules because we're all in Europe, so we've already got a squad cost control. We don't need any more rules to stay closer to the teams in the bottom half of the table. But what you're doing by bringing in new rules is you're restricting us in the global game, and that's something that we want to try and avoid.
Again, I get that it's all at the proposal stage. We don't 100% know anything, but the one thing that does seem quite eye-catching is the penalties for potentially breaking these rules if they do come in. They're talking about for every 6.5 million, I've seen quotes that you could get like a 6-point deduction. Do you think that's realistic?
Yeah. So just to make clear, this really all comes from the Everton and Nottingham Forest cases. So the PSR cases. So eventually, after you go through those cases and look at where the penalties ended up, they effectively ended up with a formula that's similar to this, a kind of 6-point minimum plus an amount per 6.5 million on top. So it's not 6 points per 6.5 million. It's 6 points plus 1 point per 6.5 million. Now it probably also has a cap, of 8 or 9 points, and it's also before mitigation. So the way it works, if you look at something like the Nottingham Forest case, they had a penalty, but then they were given a certain percentage back for mitigation that then ended up, I think, from memory, at 4 points. So it would be similar sorts of calculations to that. So these very serious points deduction proposals and tariff are not a surprise. They are actually in line with what the league has previously said. Now, the issue is, well, first of all, we don't know that there is a cap. We don't know. So in the PSR cases that existed before, you could assume that the cap of 9 points for a club that went into administration was the probable cap when you looked at all of the considerations in those elements. And so teams probably felt they weren't going to get more than eight points. If you're saying there's no cap, some of the arguments from some of the clubs are that you could actually have a fairly modest breach in percentage terms and all of a sudden end up with a 20-point deduction, which obviously they're up in arms about. But I think there's no real way of getting around the points penalties, because unlike with UEFA, the Premier League has taken the view that any breach of these sorts of financial spending rules breaches, any of them, are one, very serious, and two, should be punished with a sporting sanction because they relate to sporting advantage. And so those principles are already set out, as I say, in the cases, the historic cases, but particularly in the cases in relation to Everton and Nottingham Forest. And it's very hard to kind of backtrack from that position. The Premier League have already argued that very powerfully in those cases, and then also have had that view endorsed by the panels who have agreed with them and said, yes, we agree that any breach of these types of rules are serious, are sporting advantage, and therefore should suffer a significant sporting penalty. So I don't think it's a surprise that that kind of tariff of penalties are what is being proposed, and I think that will sit, whether this is the breach for anchoring, or whether that's the breach for PSR, or whether that's the breach for the equivalent of the UEFA squad cost control calculation. These sorts of penalties for those breaches of those rules, I think, are where the Premier League is looking. And it's just very hard, I think, for the Premier League to reverse from where it's been to get to more like a UEFA situation. UEFA have decided that actually these penalties should be largely financial and should be fairly modest, and should have large elements of suspended sentence effectively in them, so it should go on for a few years, that they allow the clubs to fix the problem, and only in the worst cases would they really introduce big penalties. But the Premier League has always taken a different view, that these sorts of breaches are just much more serious.
So, Stefan, we're seeing voting on this next month. If people aren't opposed to it, if it goes ahead, when are we expecting to see it? And what would you say to the people that are saying that if you introduce any kind of spend cap on salaries, that you could potentially ruin the Premier League?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said earlier, I think this sort of concept of doomsday, I think, is excessive. I think, what will likely happen if these rules are implemented is that the clubs will adjust, and they will find a way to generally comply, certainly at the top of the game. So as long as there isn't a big shock, so a big fall in broadcast revenue, for example, in which case they'll just change the rules anyway. They'll probably just abandon the multiplier, or increase the multiplier to 6 or 7 times. So even in that scenario, it's unlikely to be the doomsday that's been spoken about. I do think that there is a potential risk of self-sabotage on a global basis. I think this is not a very, I would say it's not a very American approach to building the league from here. I would say putting in place more restrictions feels quite restrictive, and not necessarily as sort of capitalist as possibly a lot of the owners would want to look at it. So I think that there is a sort of an issue. I think in that respect, we are going to end up restricting the Premier League unnecessarily, potentially. But as I say, I think it feels to me quite a minor issue for even the biggest clubs, and even those clubs who are closest to a breach. And if it gets voted through, I think there's still some question marks over the implementation period. I suspect it will not be implemented mid-season, so I think it would be looking to be implemented at the start of next season. And then there's also the issue as to how the Premier League are going to deal with all of these types of rules that look at squad cost control and anchoring, and they're going to have to consider whether they're going to be dealt with in the same way that UEFA deal with these, which is on a calendar year basis, or whether they're going to be dealt with on the PSR timetable, which is on a financial year basis, effectively, for most teams to the 30th of June. and it's not clear from the outside without seeing the paperwork that's gone to the clubs. It's not clear which way round they're thinking of doing that. But that's another complexity. And importantly, for people that are looking at it from the outside, it's going to make our job in terms of analysing the situation and who's close to these limits and who's not. It's going to make that very difficult because we're simply not going to have the information. It won't be the information that's in the accounts. It will be a separate set of information that only goes to UEFA and to the Premier League. And that's the situation that we already have with UEFA squad cost control, which runs to a calendar year.
Stefan, thank you so much for joining us today and explaining all of that. It was great to talk to you.
Thanks a lot.